Oh, looks like we're live.
Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of the Health Storytelling Author Q&A series for this semester, spring 2025. I'm Maryn McKenna. I'm a journalist and author and senior fellow in the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University, which makes me your curator for this series and your host as we undertake our latest set of author conversations. In a moment, I'll introduce you to my guest, Carl Zimmer, an award-winning New York Times columnist and author of many books, and his brand new book, Airborne, The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe. But first, let me tell you about this series. At least once per month during the academic year, we invite writers whose journalistic or academic books examine health, the science and history of health, and health's intersection with society. This series of conversations is sponsored by the Emory Center for the Study of Human Health, along with an array of fantastic co-sponsors. This spring, those are the Georgia Center for the Book, a local affiliate of the Library of Congress that stages very frequent public conversations with authors, illustrators, poets, and others to bring the news of new books to the public. And Emory's Center for Public Scholarship and Engagement, which creates opportunities for faculty, staff, and students to share ideas with local and global audiences. And as part of that, the center's new Ideas Festival Emory, which launched last September on Emory's Oxford campus and will return this coming October with an amazing lineup of speakers. And finally, tonight, this is a special co-production with the amazing Atlanta Science Festival, which right now is sponsoring 2 weeks of events that bring science to the public and kindly agreed to co-produce this appearance by Carl. So let me tell you who else has been appearing in this series, which is live streamed on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, and archived on YouTube. You already heard about Carl Zimmer and Airborne, which was published by Dutton just last month. In January, we heard from Johns Hopkins Associate Professor Caitlin Rivers, PhD, with Crisis Averted, The Hidden Science of Fighting Outbreaks, published by Viking. In February, I talked to Dr. Adam Ratner, professor of pediatrics and microbiology at the New York University Grossman School of Medicine, about his timely new book, Booster Shots: The Urgent Lessons of Measles and the Uncertain Future of Human Health. And next month, on April 16th, Emory professor Jaap de Rude will talk to me about Doctors by Nature, how ants, apes, and other animals heal themselves, from Princeton University Press. One final note, this is a live event. You can interact with us, and we encourage you to do that. If you want to ask us a question, please comment on any of the platforms where you're watching us, and our producer, Stefan Kaplan of Spin It Social, will make sure that we see what you've said. Do note that I'll turn to your questions in the second half of this 60-minute live stream, but you can put your questions into those comment boxes at any time. Now, let's turn to our book and guest. New York Magazine once called Carl Zimmer the country's most respected science journalist. He's been writing about the frontiers of biology for several decades in the best-known science outlets in the US, including Discover, Scientific American, and The Atlantic. He began writing for the New York Times in 2004 and became a columnist there in 2013. In 2021, he shared the Pulitzer Prize that the Times won for its coverage of the COVID pandemic. His first book, At the Water's Edge, was published in 1998. Airborne is his 15th book. Carl, welcome to this series. Thank you so much for coming.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much.
So I always like to ask people to start with, this is the same question everybody gets. How did you come to write this book?
This book, I guess the seed was planted during the COVID pandemic. So I and my colleagues were all scrambling to write about this new disease. I know you were as well. And I mean, I think we were all, one big question was like, well, there were many questions, but one of them was, well, how does this spread? And there was this huge debate that was blowing up where you had sort of a standard view of it that, maybe you get it from surfaces or, maybe someone like just coughs right in your face. And there are these other people who were saying it's airborne, by which they meant that it was spreading around the rooms, buildings like smoke. And that took a long time to sort out. COVID is airborne. And I just, as the more it played out, the more puzzled I got. Like, why would this be such a source of heat? And, I would talk to scientists and they would say, well, this subject, this more broadly of life in the air, there's been a lot of fighting, a lot of contestation about this for a long time. And they would tell me like, have you ever heard of William Firth Wells? And I said, no. And so they're like, well, you should go back. And, I that's what I love doing in my books is to explore history, which you don't get to do so much when you're writing about stuff in the here and now for journalism. And I basically found myself just completely fascinated by this science of life in the air, aerobiology. It has a really extraordinary history, goes in all sorts of weird directions, unexpected ones, some very dark turns. And and so that I found myself writing another book.
So we are eventually going to talk about COVID. There are so many other things I want to ask you about first, but I do think we should probably start by defining terms a little more. Mm-hmm. What's airborne when we're talking about pathogens? And given that there was so much debate in COVID, like what's not airborne? What were the other methods of transmission? I'm so sorry that people were contending over at the time.
Sure. So and what's interesting, I think, in this kind of a story is that I'm an old English major, and so like I'm very intrigued when a lot of what the conflict is about language and about words and what we mean by the words, and maybe we're using the same word with different meanings. And we're still having this problem right now with words like airborne. So when disease researchers are talking about airborne transmission, what they typically are talking about is that a germ, virus, fungal spore, bacteria, what have you, is basically just drifting around in the air, just on its own. It's so tiny and it's just riding little currents and it's floating around. So it's airborne in the way that smoke is airborne. Mm-hmm. And so that can be referring to what's just drifting around you indoors. It can also be referring to what's drifting around outside, because the whole atmosphere is full of living things, and most of them we're breathing them in all the time. Most of them are entirely harmless, but some of them aren't. And so you can get sick with something that may have been floating for hundreds of miles before you breathed it in. That's in opposition to other kinds of, when you're talking about disease, that's in distinction with things like contaminated surfaces. So if I kind of wipe my nose and just touch a doorknob, and then you go and use the same doorknob, and then you wipe your face because you're not thinking about it, that's one route of transmission. When we were wiping down our groceries, we were kind of concerned about that kind of transmission, sometimes called fomites. obviously there's, you can get sick from water that's contaminated with bacteria, or a mosquito that's carrying a virus, or, sexually transmitted diseases. Where things get a little blurry is like, if like someone coughs at you, there was this idea that like they have like large droplets that just fling out, and they'd be like cannonballs. So they'd be arcing down, being pulled down by gravity. So if you were close enough, you might get hit. But if you were far away enough, gravity would just make it fall and you'd be fine, which is basically where our sort of, 3 foot or 6 foot rules would come from. Like, just if you just stand back, you'll be okay. So that's like a kind of quick taxonomy of all these things.
It's kind of haunting to me that there are places you can go in public now and still see the 6 foot stickers on the pavement at retail establishments and, coffee shops and things like that, where people were meant to stand in line. There are those markers that told us that it was thought that 6 feet was the appropriate protective distance. And we'll get to that in a minute. Sure. But what I really want to ask first is, it's fascinating to me, and you do this so beautifully in the book in telling this very long and tangled history, that the idea of what we would now call airborne transmission is something that goes back to the very earliest thinking about disease, long before we had the germ theory, that back in the time of the Greeks and the Romans and when the Arabian world was keeping alive medicine during the Dark Ages, that people were contending over whether the air was a vehicle for disease.
Yes. And so, an early form of this thinking was promoted by Hippocrates. And Hippocrates would talk about what he would call miasmas. A miasma was actually that was an older term. It more had kind of religious overtones, that it was like a curse that would be visited on people or a city or something. And you'd have to go through a purification to get out from under it. And so Hippocrates took this term and then applied it to the air itself. So somehow the air itself could become corrupted. And he had these ideas about weather or maybe things in the ground. Some people would start to talk about the stars being able to do this. So it's the air itself. There's nothing alive in the air, but the air itself would start to be able to cause disease. And so if you breathed that in, you might get a particular disease from a particular kind of miasma. It kind of worked on its own terms, in the sense of like, Hippocrates and his followers would point to situations where like a whole bunch of people, say in a village, would all get the same disease all at once. And they're old and young, and they have these different kinds of, ways of living, and yet they all got sick. So what do they have in common? Well, they're all breathing the air. So they must have breathed the same air, must have had miasma in it. So that was that. So, and that was, one form or another that literally lasted about 2,500 years. But there were these competing ideas about contagion, where there was this sense of like, well, there's something like a particular, tiny thing that somehow can spread from person to person and somehow can recreate the disease in each person. So in other words, that it transmits. But, a lot of these ideas about contagion came long before anyone had this idea that there were microorganisms, that there were like, life forms that are so tiny you couldn't even see them, and that these might actually be growing inside of people. That only came much later.
So let's make a huge jump in history, sort of skidding over the beginning of the germ theory. And because I want to get to the people who are so important to your narrative, the scientists, the Wells. You mentioned one of them, William Firth Wells, and his wife, Mildred Weeks Wells, and their compatriot, I guess, fellow traveler, Fred Meyer. These are the people who made this sense of pathogens traveling in the air as a source of disease into something of a science, right?
Yes, that's right. So,
and none of us have heard of them.
Right. I know it's really wild, but after having learned about them, I mean, I mean, a lot of what I had to do to learn about them was go into archives, to read old letters, unpublished memos, and things that are just tucked away in storage because they have been forgotten, as you say. And yet, they in the 1930s, they together, I would say, really, they created this science called aerobiology. Fred Meyer even gave it the name, and it was really poised to take off as a mature science. But then everything went sideways. So Fred Meyer, just to start with, he was he worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He studied plant diseases. He once called himself a watermelon doctor. So people who study plant diseases they were faster to recognize the role, how things can travel through the air and cause disease. Because everything from the potato blight that caused the Irish famine to massive crop failures in the American Midwest from wheat stem rust, like the evidence was there if you really looked carefully at it. You could see how spores would travel hundreds of miles and wipe out crops. And so what Fred Meyer was trying to understand was, well, how far can these things go? Where exactly do they come from? Where do they go? How are they carried? Like, can we predict this? Is there anything we do to control these things? And so he would go on these crazy flights in biplanes trying to catch things in the air, and then collaborated with remarkable, very famous people like Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart to go even further and higher searching for life. William and Mildred Wells were this husband and wife team who they developed a theory about airborne infection in the 1930s that really kind of that instead of talking about miasmas, they started talking about how the physics of how we breathe can allow germs to escape our bodies, and can then, because of the physics of these tiny droplets that hold these pathogens, can then carry them to other people. All of this was this was not secret at that time. These people were making big headlines at the time. William Wells figured out that ultraviolet light could kill these germs in the air. There'd be big headlines, scientists fight flu germs with violet ray and things like that. And people were really excited by aerobiology. And yet, as you say, like, they have been forgotten.
And why do you think that is? Why is it? Is this a story about other forms of science succeeding paradigms that look like they're established? Or is it a story of sort of who gets over the curb in science and succeeds and who doesn't? What are the factors that made this not stick around?
I think that in working on this book, I came to feel that, maybe we tend to think of science as this almost kind of like human independent process. It just happens and it unfolds and it's self-correcting. And so somehow the people don't matter. It is true that the way science works, there is the possibility to learn more and to even, to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. No question about that. But I think the course of scientific history can really depend on a lot of contingency. Mm-hmm. So, Fred Meyer was an incredibly charismatic figure, and he was pulling together all these scientists to work on aerobiology with him. He basically invents the science. He gets all these people on board to work with him. I don't think they even realized that they were all doing the same thing. And he even persuaded the government to start planning on opening up a big research center. We're talking like something on par with like the National Weather Service. But he died. He suddenly died, and he was gone. And there was no one with his quite, combination of charisma and, just endless energy to make it happen. And so this community kind of fizzled. And meanwhile, William and Mildred Wells, When you when you go through the archives, you start finding stuff about people talking about them, and then they were their own worst enemies. They were they they were constantly fighting. They were in constant turf wars. They got fired a couple different times. And people, I think, William Wells in particular, I mean, I think he feels diagnosable. It's not,
Mm.
I'm not you can't really do that when you're reading these things, but, he was the sort of person who would harangue people for hours and hours and hours, and they would just be like, just leave me alone. But but they would but their data was really good. And so it's really tragic that, they just were losing out. And I do think also that there was this consensus from the early 1900s that the air is basically harmless. Like, and anyone who says otherwise just believes in miasmas.
So that's one of the things that's really interesting to me in reading this history, and it recurs periodically throughout the book. You really draw out this thread, the degree to which the idea of infections being airborne and the air transporting pathogens was met with such hostility. I mean, even back when the Wellses were working, prominent early members of what came to be the CDC were publicly attacking them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, one of those prominent founders, Alexander Langmuir, I mean, it looks to me like he did his part to try to torpedo the Wellses' careers. Just said, you need to stop funding these people because nobody trusts anything they say anymore. I mean, it's there in writing. And so I mean, I think we're a little hobbled by hindsight, because, when like I myself, like kind of came to this project after the COVID pandemic, where I could see like how obvious it is that a disease can be airborne based on all these case studies and so on that got done during the pandemic. And then to go back and be like, wait, but how, like, I don't understand. Like, everybody is constantly like hammering on them, and dismissing their evidence, or shrugging, or saying, well, it's a nice idea, but you don't have enough evidence, and so on. I mean, I do think this research is tough. It is tough to really like demonstrably show that diseases spread really in by any means, actually. I mean, epidemiology is hard. The physics of airborne transmission is really weird and messy and complicated. And the Wellses were doing very sort of simple, 1930s era work on this. They didn't have computers to simulate the flow of the jets of air that we release. So there were just a lot of things that were stacked up against them. And again, like it just goes to show that, like, science doesn't necessarily unfold in some perfect, happy way.
So I'm going to start bringing in questions. I want to remind everyone that you can ask questions of us. Just put them in the comment box wherever you are. And I will ask them during the second half of this, which amazingly we are almost at. So we just had a question from one of the folks who's watching, asking about how much of a difference just the timing of discoveries makes to science. I know you make the point in the book that some interest in airborne infection for tuberculosis was sort of abandoned because antibiotics came along, and it seemed like tuberculosis would be curable. And so exactly where it was coming from didn't seem that important anymore.
Yeah, that's another issue, is like, people will judge how interesting a question even is. So with tuberculosis, well, William Firth Wells was really, after everything else was falling apart in the late 1940s, he wanted to demonstrate that tuberculosis is airborne. He really felt that would be sort of the kind of the flagship. If he could get people to see that, then they'd start to think about other diseases too. But that, as I write in the book, that experiment, it took like a decade to get off the ground because nobody was particularly interested. But finally, he was able to get it done. It is, in effect, it killed him. I won't go into it. Just the details are too wild, and it's worth reading in the book. But yeah, but by the time that the experiment was underway, antibiotics were available, and the people who invented those antibiotics said, like, well, we got antibiotics. Who needs to really care about how TB spreads? So then people are like, well, maybe TB is airborne, but do we really care? We've got these antibiotics. Of course, the antibiotics started to fail, and and it still matters that TB is airborne. TB is killing over 1 million people a year, and it's mainly spreading in the air. And there are lots of other diseases spreading through the air. So yes, timing is also a big factor in how science plays out.
So one of the things that's so tragic about this story is that while these early adopters or these early explorers of this theory were being roundly denounced and disregarded by sort of mainstream science, there was a whole other section of society that was actually listening to them very carefully, and that was the military. And this is a terribly sad and also scary part of the story about how acutely aerobiology was actually being studied and taken up for the purposes of bad actors. Do you want to go into that?
Yeah. So the idea that you could use microorganisms as a weapon in war or in terrorism and so on, that this goes back to actually to the sort of the early germ theory disease days. H.G. Wells wrote a short story about a terrorist who would try to use cholera to wreak havoc in London. This was a story he wrote in like the 1890s. The American military didn't really take it that seriously, honestly. Like in World War I, there wasn't really that much. The Germans tried to kill some horses. I mean, that about as far as it went. But by World War II, they were getting really worried that the Japanese and the Nazis were both experimenting and developing biological weapons. And so they said, we need to do that too, ostensibly to defend themselves. But part of that defense meant creating huge arsenals of these things. So it was almost like a nuclear war situation. Like, well, if you drop anthrax bombs on us, we will drop them on you. And so then the military starts saying, like, this is all happening in secret during World War II. And they basically looked around and they're like, oh, look at all this work by people like Fred Meyer and William and Mildred Wells. We'll take that. We'll take that. We'll take that. They built some of William Wells's equipment, but on a much bigger scale. They opened up this whole aerobiology building at this place called Camp Dietrich, where they started testing out all these weapons. And instead of, the Wellses were trying to use aerobiology to figure out how to protect people from disease, and the military was using all that same approach to figure out how can we kill people through the air. Airborne disease it was clear that airborne disease would be the best way to kill people with biological weapons. And so they created all sorts of things. They created things to attack food supplies. William Wells didn't know about any of this until the end of World War II, when some of it became public. And he didn't realize it, but they kept the U.S. and the Soviet Union, kept building up huge stocks of biological weapons for decades after that.
And there were within those biological weapons programs unpleasant events that showed how that the airborne theory, if that's I guess that's the right word, was actually correct, right, in both Russia and then also in the United States.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, even early on in World War II, like there would these accidents at Camp Dietrich, which would sort of demonstrate how easy it was for things to spread. I mean, there's a disease called parrot fever that the military is really interested in, and that bacteria, just someone was handling some stuff and poof, like all of a sudden it was in the air, they inhaled it and they got parrot fever and almost died. Then a really sort of an outdoor example of aerobiology in action happened in 1979 in the Soviet Union, when there was this big facility that made anthrax spores for biological weapons, in a place called Sverdlovsk. And for reasons that still aren't entirely clear, basically the system for venting this stuff kind of broke down, and they just vented the spores out down, and they just blew downwind and, you know, killed people in its path. And it took a while, you know, it took the fall of the Soviet Union for Western scientists to be able to get in and to really get to the bottom of what happened there. But that clearly was, you know, again, aerobiology in action in a gruesome way. And then here in the United States, you know, there was always this terror, a very driving terror, that biological warfare was going to to come to us. You know, there are all these different fears about how diseases could go airborne and so on, and huge amounts of money were being spent for what was called biodefense. You know, the best example of, you know, people dying of you know, airborne attack was when people would open up letters that had anthrax spores in them. This was the Amerithrax killings, and, you know, the spores would come out and people would inhale them, and some of them died. There was a belief at the time, oh, this is Al Qaeda, you know, this you know, this kind of fear got us into the Iraq War. But as far as we can tell, those spores came from what is now Fort Detrick, that same place where biological warfare was started in the US. And, you know, there's still debate about who exactly was sending them out, but you know, that was, you know, American-made anthrax, that's for sure.
Mm. I want to get to COVID, but I also want to talk about some of the things in the book that explore just sort of the purely enchanting aspects of aerobiology, because I think those are some of the things that even people who don't want to hear about COVID anymore are going to be interested in. The ability to study the burden of the air in a way that wasn't possible to those early experimenters. There's actually someone from, but one of our commenters has asked, with advances in air sampling and genomic sequencing, what emerging discoveries could there be that'll transform our understanding of air quality and climate change? And you talk so beautifully in the book about the emerging understanding of sort of the aerobiome. So can we just talk about the pure pleasant science for a minute before we go back to the bad stuff?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is actually not a COVID book in the sense of,
no, it is important to say this is not a COVID book.
It's, you know, COVID figures in it, but there are lots of things in the air, and we've really only just started to appreciate just the full scope of it. And to kind of, you know, and I argue in the book that, like, there's been life in the air probably pretty much ever since there was life on Earth, period, because you know, every crashing wave will send up little droplets, some of which will have bacteria, viruses, algae, whatever's in the surface water, that's going to go up, and it can go up into the clouds, it can go up into the stratosphere. And when life came on land, that was another staging ground for life to get into the air, whether it was plant spores, fungal spores, pollen, all the bacteria and other things that live on those plants or form crusts and so on. And the numbers are really crazy. So about a trillion bacteria rise up from the ocean and the land every year. I don't even know quite how to think about a trillion things, but there you are.
I'm trying to think about the zeros, and it's making me.
No, the air is the numbers in terms of what's in the air is crazy. There was one study of just of insects. You don't think about insects being up in the air, but like they can be in just colossal numbers of insects that migrate. In China, over just a small area, a couple 100 miles long, scientists set up some radar arrays, and over the course of 1 year, they counted 9.4 trillion insects that are just passing over this one area. So, yeah, and so you know, a tiny percentage of that diversity, you know, can make us really sick. But it's probably like a really fundamental part of how the natural world works. You know, like it spreads biological diversity around in oceans and on land. The clouds, every cloud probably has a couple thousand species of bacteria in it, and some of them are growing. They're eating the cloud. And when it rains, the cloud is showering down billions and billions of bacteria. So just leaving our own health aside, the aerobiome is one of the three great, spheres of life on Earth.
So now I have to go back to the bad stuff. I'm sorry. I am really struck reading the book how persistent some dogmas, I guess, some scientific dogmas within this science of aerobiology are, from that stubborn insistence that airborne transmission is just not really a thing, to the more sort of sophisticated but still stubborn insistence that there are particular particle sizes that govern whether airborne transmission actually happens or not. And that seems to have been something that people hammered on for decades and controlled outbreak response in a couple of really important international outbreaks. Do you want to talk about this concept of 5 microns and where it came from and how dominant it was?
Yeah, it's a very strange aspect of a very strange aspect of this history, but it really kind of demonstrates how things just kind of go awry and then don't fix themselves as fast as you'd like. So William Wells was studying tuberculosis, and he was basically transmitting it through the air to animals. He was doing an animal study, and he was showing pretty effectively that that the bacteria that cause tuberculosis, the only way they can start up an infection is they have to not only get in your lung, but get all the way to the end, to the tiny little sacs, the alveoli. And those passageways are super tiny. So like a dust particle, some people thought tuberculosis spread on dust. Dust is too big. So dust is in this world is like a big boulder, so the bacteria have to be actually in droplets, and they have to be in tiny, tiny droplets, less than 5 microns, in order to get all the way to the end there. So in the 1960s, Alexander Langmuir is partly to blame for this. This all got kind of like shorthanded and distorted, so that there was this idea that developed that, okay, maybe airborne disease is conceivable, but it could only be spread by the droplets that are smaller than 5 microns. And then the idea became, well, that's because droplets that are smaller than 5 microns are the only ones that can stay airborne, which is just not true. And so you just keep seeing this, like just printed in guidelines and from CDC, WHO, and so on, and it just wasn't true. And the amazing thing is that in the early 2000s, there were these scientists coming into this field, people like, say, Lindsay Marr, Virginia Tech. She was studying, she had more of a physics training. She studied air pollution and so on. And she's like, what? Like, who told them that? That's not true. Like, I teach my undergraduates, how to derive a formula for how big droplets have to be to stay airborne. It's much bigger than that. And so that really like blinded people to like the not only the rich complexity of the droplets and other things that can stay airborne, but the potential ways in which diseases can spread through the air. It was just a crazy thing. And it was only in the COVID pandemic that finally people like Lindsay were able to get all these public health authorities to just give up the 5 micron obsession. It's such a strange thing, but it was an enduring misunderstanding.
As you explained, this idea, which turned out to be incorrect, it was so dominant in the SARS pandemic in 2003, in the influenza pandemic of 2009-10, and it was also incredibly important at the start of COVID. And I think now we have to come to COVID. And I am going to ask you in a minute about Lindsay Marr and the group that she helped gather together, because it seems to me like they changed both science and public understanding. But we have to get into the difficult history first. I think all of us who haven't completely memory hold COVID remember the early days when the authorities were saying, you don't need to wear a mask. This is not an airborne thing. You don't need to protect yourself. And then at a certain point, they turned around and said, yes, you do. And I think we can probably trace the mask wars of 2021 and 2022 and then the beginning of the political ferment around COVID to that switcheroo. So what stands out to you about this very confused time? What are the points you'd want to make about it?
Yeah, so there were so many problems lurking when COVID started, so that we were really, as one scientist said to me, history set us up. I mean, we were just so not in a good place to deal with an airborne pandemic. And part of the problem was that even at the start of COVID in 2020, the people like Lindsay Marr were in a very small minority. They had been talking about airborne infection for years at this point, having rediscovered the Welleses, but they still were like, this is going to take us decades to get this message across. That's just how they felt. And another problem was that, there were some, preparations that would have helped for an airborne pandemic, like stockpiling masks, except that in the Obama administration, after that 2009 pandemic, they burned through a lot of masks to deal with the flu. And Obama really struggled to get that stockpile back up. Didn't really do a very good job by the end of it. And Trump didn't help at all in that regard. And so, there was just very little personal protective equipment needed to really deal with it. And I mean, I think that was part of this behind. I think that was part of what was behind the strategy, where people were saying, public health figures are saying, you don't need to wear a mask, people. February 2020, early March, you don't need to wear a mask, because they were saying, like, you don't need to wear a mask, and we need to make sure that our healthcare professionals have enough masks, which, like, there's something implicit in there. What it's telling you is, like, we just don't have very many masks, like, why is that? That's because of, like, a real lack of preparation. People in the United States were not ready for, I don't think we're really ready for sort of like, widespread public masking, because it really hadn't been done since the 1918 flu pandemic. In countries in Asia, it had been much more a common thing, and it kind of become much more culturally accepted. So I think that played into it as well.
So I think now is the point at which we talk about Lindsay Marr and her group, because this stubborn insistence that was at that point was almost a century old, that you outlined so beautifully, that infections are not airborne, that they're droplet, that had governed so many public health responses. She and a group who sort of coalesced around her and a few other people decided to really publicly push back on that. And what I love about this story is not just what they did, but also that, kind of like the Welleses and Meyer, they were outsiders to sort of the central science around this. They were engineers and they weren't necessarily infectious disease epidemiologists. So the group of 36, who are they?
Yeah, so there were 36 scientists who had, between them, had a lot of expertise actually studying real infectious diseases, but coming from this perspective more of saying, like, let's really kind of try to understand how it is, in terms of physics and so on, these diseases can get from one person to another. And, for them, just looking at early news reports just gave them a really sinking feeling, like, I think we're dealing with something that's pretty good at spreading through the air. And, they wanted to get the WHO to pay attention to this. And so, they approached WHO as a group. And, as they recounted, they were very much brushed off. Like, don't, no, we don't think it's airborne, or we're looking at it, don't worry about it. In any case, like their call to take seriously that this could be airborne and to deal with, public health precautions accordingly, dismissed. And they they got really, they describe, being yelled at in phone calls about this. And so they're like, okay, we gotta go public with this. And so they brought in even more people who felt the same way and made a big public statement like, hey folks, we think COVID is airborne. And they also looked for opportunities to do the research to try to persuade people who might be skeptical. And one example I focus on a lot in the book is this choir, this singing group, the Skagit Valley Chorale, where March 10th, 2020, one person came into rehearsal, had COVID, and infected almost 60 other people. And they explored that outbreak with the singers themselves, and showed how really like airborne infection really was the route that made the most sense for that. And yeah, so they were working on this, month in and month out, to try to move the needle, and they did.
So I'm so glad you brought up the chorale, because that was the thing I wanted to ask you about next. And I do just want to say to folks who are watching, I see that you've got a couple of questions about sort of what happens next to aerobiology. What are the next steps in science? And I promise I'm going to get to them. That's the next things I'll ask. But the story of the chorale is both really sad and really lovely. And so I want to hear Carl talk about it for a minute. So Carl, this community chorale of people who just come together for the joy of singing are doing that at the very start of the pandemic. And then what happens?
Yeah, we have to sort of put our mind back to like, late February, early March. I think for a lot of people, they'd be like, well, there's this thing called COVID. I don't know. It doesn't sound good, but I'm not really sure. And it doesn't really sound like it's really here in the United States. But the CDC was giving guidelines, if you're showing symptoms, if you're, stay away from people, treating it like influenza. And unfortunately, like COVID is really good at spreading through the air, even when you're not having any symptoms. You don't have to cough big droplets. You can just breathe and get people sick. So they thought they were doing everything they were supposed to be doing, but but the virus had already gotten to their neck of the woods, and people around them were sick. And there was one person who appears to have been sick on this night of this rehearsal. So suddenly, like, they're all back at home, and they're just feeling terrible, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, like, is this is it? Then this is crazy." They did the right thing. The public health authorities were like, you need to like isolate and stay home and not give it to anybody else. And they did. So, a lot more people could have gotten sick. Unfortunately, like 2 members of the chorale died from this outbreak. It was really quite tragic. And, this group, I talked to some of them about all this, and they were, it was very scarring. I mean, first of all, for a long time, they couldn't sing together. They tried doing it over Zoom, it was very awkward and difficult. And a lot of people dropped out. And they just kept persevering. And then, they started to sing outdoors. And, like Washington State in October, November, like it was cold and wet and rainy. They could hardly hear themselves over the rain that was pounding on a sort of a ceiling where they were. And then eventually they found a place where they could rehearse indoors, but they kept the doors open and they all had their masks on. And, eventually, they were able to start to sing again together, and then to actually even perform. And I went to see a performance of theirs in 2023, one of their first performances back together in their old performance space. And it was lovely. They had a lovely time. But, they had little carbon dioxide monitors. They were making sure that the space was safe. They were definitely very marked by that experience. But they're trying to move on.
One of the aspects of the story that you tell, both in the beginning of the book where you describe going to that concert, and then also toward the end when you relate how their experience intersected with the group of 36's advocacy, you do such a lovely job of describing the way that they try to find their way back to being in community together, that they all have very different points of view about what's safe and what they can ask of each other and what they can ask of their audiences. And to me, it really brings back the widespread uncertainty that we all had during COVID of how do we find our way back into what felt like what we used to think of as regular life, and what are the things that we can ask of each other, and what are the things that we can insist on. So I enjoyed that part so much.
Great.
And now we're going to talk about the future.
Okay.
So there are a couple of folks have questions, but let me just ask generally, where do you this science of aerobiology that you've brought back to public notice, where do you see it going? You have this lovely closing anecdote about going to a bar that's lit by UV lights and is safe to breathe in as a result.
It's hard to predict where we're going to go from here, in part because, the history of aerobiology and of airborne diseases shows us just how powerful the urge is just to ignore it and pretend it's not happening, or that it's just a nightmare that you don't want to think about. So there's that. And there is also, all the uncertainty that comes with the way the current administration is wiping out funding for a lot of the kind of research that we need to understand things like airborne infection. So I don't know how things are going to go, but I will say that certainly there's a lot of technology that exists right now that could be implemented to reduce the risk of airborne infections across the board pretty substantially. There are some diseases we know are particularly good at being spread through the air. COVID, measles, tuberculosis, chickenpox, and then there are probably others that's probably one of their routes, but we still don't have enough solid data. Influenza is probably one of them. And the new pandemic, like the disease X, the disease Y that we get hit with, might well be another airborne disease. And we can deal with those things with ultraviolet light, for example, just as one element. This is what William and Mildred Wells were playing around with in the 1930s, and they protected children from a measles outbreak in Philadelphia in 1940. This is old stuff. And now there are, really, there's a lot of research on one particular kind of UV light called far UVC, which is showing a lot of promise, but, there are air purifiers, ventilation systems, and so on, but we just have to use them. There have to be, if there are mandates for indoor air quality, in particular for infectious disease, a lot of stuff could be, a lot of lives could be improved, put it that way.
Are you hearing from this new aerobiology community now about what they most want to do or what they're most worried about at this political moment?
Well, I think everybody that I talk to just in the whole world of medical research is holding their breath. Columbia has just shut down, a huge center for studying chronic fatigue and the related conditions. COVID can create a long COVID, which has some similarities there. That center shut down. So like everything is very there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of trauma, really, in the people I'm talking to. So, but that's across the board. So Lindsay Marr and others have, they have put forward proposed mandates. Like, what would it look like to mandate indoor air quality? This is what it would look like. If you build a building, you should have this equivalent of exchanges of fresh air every hour. If you're going to use UVC, here are our recommendations for that, and then mandate it in the same way that we have. You don't just hope that your water company, keeps out dysentery from your water supply. Like if you drink water from your faucet and you get dysentery, something's wrong. Somebody screwed up, because we have laws and regulations to that effect. So Lindsay Marr and her colleagues have laid this out. Like, here's how you could do it. Nobody's really done it yet. I mean, no government on earth has done it yet. Belgium is making steps towards it. Yeah, unfortunately, they fought really hard to get this recognition about airborne infection, and they're still pushing and fighting. This work is not over.
I think I want to ask for my last question, because we are at the top of the hour. Did doing this research, did it change your behavior at all?
Well, I have my own little carbon dioxide meter. I don't know if you carry one around, Maryn. I definitely take this with me, when I'm traveling, just to be aware of. This measures the carbon dioxide in a room, and this is just me in the room, and it's already above 1,000 parts per million, because I have the windows closed. I'm much more aware of ventilation, and I still keep carry masks with me. I don't wear them as often as I did in the peak of the pandemic, but I have a supply, and certainly, if I'm on a plane and we're on the runway and the air circulation hasn't started really, I'll definitely mask up. But on the other hand, you have to breathe. Breathing. I can't sing. Some people love to sing. I love to talk. We have to share the air. And so, it's just a matter of trying to find that peaceful way to do it. So I am mindful of those issues now.
Well, I hope after hearing this chat and reading your book that other people will be made mindful as well. And thank you so much for talking to me about it.
Thanks a lot. It's been fun.
And that's it for this edition of the Health Storytelling Author Q&A series. Please consider giving some attention to Carl's work. You can find him. I'm going to give you a bunch of links. You can find him at his personal site, which is carlzimmer.com, and in his newsletter, Friday's Elk, which is hosted on buttondown.com, Carl Zimmer, and at his New York Times column, Origins. You can find him on the NewYorkTimes.com site. He also writes stories outside of the column Origins, and also on social media. He's primarily on Blue Sky and on Threads. And you should buy his book, which, as you can hear, is very good. It's available from Penguin Random House, which is his publisher, and at Amazon, of course, but also at bookshop.org, which we like to recommend because it is the anti-Amazon. It's a site that supports local bookstores and will funnel your orders to them. That's it. Please join us next month on April 16th to hear from Emory Professor Jaap de Rode about his fascinating and really charming new book, Doctors by Nature: How Ants, Apes, and Other Animals Heal Themselves, just published by Princeton University Press. You can visit our RSVP page to sign up in advance for that live stream. And you can find all of these chats archived on the YouTube account of the Emory Center for the Study of Human Health. So until next time, I'm Maryn McKenna on behalf of the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University, the Georgia Center for the Book, Emory's Center for Public Scholarship and Engagement, the Ideas Festival Emory, and special tonight, the Atlanta Science Festival. And from me, thank you for watching. See you next month.